Hi everyone. I'll be carrying on with the RI Williams Super One question. Uh, so the one that I'm looking at now is question 2. The world would be a better place if everyone spoke the same language. Do you agree? Okay, so for this question, I think the the keywords that probably immediately stand out to you is better place, right? Yeah, okay. So better place, I think we can think of it as uh, more peaceful, less friction, greater understanding, uh, and maybe in general, better environment for human flourishing, right? So something like that would constitute a better place. And then same language, I think this one is quite straightforward. Same language is just like a global lingua franca, right? Like a common tongue. All of us have the same, all of us are capable of speaking in the same language. And then, okay, so for this question, there is an, I think implicit in this statement is the view that uh, if we all speak the same language, we can understand each other better, right? So that is an assumption that you need to be able to identify and then address, right? So the assumption we would understand each other better if we speak the same, right? So that's the implicit idea in this proposition. So when you craft your responses, I think you would have to either uh, give points to support this assumption or reject this assumption through your arguments. Okay. Um, Another thing about this question is also you need to be careful of what this question is not asking you. Okay. This question, we have to take the question as it is. So they're simply saying if everyone spoke the same language. So that means, so think of the world that we live in today, and then just add the extra attribute that we all speak something in common, for example, English. Okay, this question is not suggesting that the world would be a better place if we only speak one language, right? We only spoke in one language. That would be a completely different question. Okay, so it's not saying that uh, there's one language that is uh, that removes all the other uh, range of languages that we speak, right? We are just saying that we have one more attribute now, and that is that we all can speak a same language. Okay, so be careful about what the question is not asking also. For this question, I suppose if you want to agree with the proposition, there are two positions that you can take. You can either make an argument for why same language uh, creates a better place, or you can argue why different languages create a worse place, right? So I think both are possible ways you can approach this question. They are slightly different. Uh, okay, so let's go through some possible arguments. Possible yes. Okay. I think maybe the mm, we can talk about how language is a subset of culture, right? And then the thing about culture is that we use it to distinguish ourselves, right? Like I'm a person from this cultural background, and therefore I'm different from you. So language is a part of that culture. And so you can say that it can be a tool used to alienate other people, right? So you can have something like that. Language as a subset of culture may lead to othering that further reinforces differences between people. So because of that, it's plausible that having a common tongue that mediates differences between different groups of people can promote unity, right? So we start off with the idea that so language is something um, that is a attribute of distinction, right? So because it is something that we can use to differentiate, Therefore, maybe if we have something in common, we create one extra thing that promotes unity. Okay, so unity would be it's bolded here because it's trying to show you that this is my way to address the better place part, right? So there is unity, so it's better place. Okay, so for some examples, I think you can probably think of something like, I think in Sri Lanka in the 1950s, I think they have this language policy, the Sinhala policy. So before that, Sri Lanka's, because they were a British colony, right? So the language of administration, the official language was English. But then when the Sinhalese, which is the dominant group, the majority in Sri Lanka, when they came into power, they established Sinhala as the official language, as the language of administration. And because of that, it alienated a lot of the Tamil speakers, right, the Tamil people. And then I think if you Google it, you'll find some statistics to show how the result of the policy was that there is a drop in employment in the civil service because they can't speak the language, right? Before that, they use English. They have a common language that both the Sinhalese and the Tamil can use. But then now, if it's just Sinhala, then you alienate the Tamil speakers, right? People with Tamil and English speakers. Yeah, so that's one of them. Maybe closer to home, you can compare Malaysia and Singapore's educational policies, right? So we have a common language. We use English as the medium. In Malaysia, they have, so in their primary schools, they have vernacular schools. So they have like Tamil medium schools, mostly populated by the Indian community. And then they have Chinese medium schools, and obviously populated by the Chinese. And then they have your normal mainstream national schools, where the medium is Malay. And what happens is that Chinese send their kids to the Chinese medium schools, Indians send their kids to the Tamil medium schools. And then your normal national schools, I think it's 95% Malays, right? The Bumi Putras. So the outcome of it is that you have some kind of because of the language, you racialize education, right? And it would have effects when these children grow up. So I think one of the manifestation is how you have very ethnicized politics in Malaysia, right? You have political parties that are predominantly Malay, in fact, sometimes only Malay. And then you have Indian political parties, Chinese representatives in their political parties. And it makes for very racialized politics. And then you can compare it to how in Singapore we have like we make an effort not to racialize our education, racialize our politics. And so it's a different, so the outcomes are quite stark in contrast. Okay. Yeah, so that is one way you can think about how language is used to other people, to alienate, to accentuate the differences between a people. Okay. Second point, you can think about, maybe you want to say something about, so one of the, like when we talk about a lingua franca, we are, one of the substitute or synonyms for it is a trade language. So it's a language used for trade, a language used for diplomacy, right? So you can make a point about social and economic relations. You can say something about how the world today, there's a lot of demand for us to be more connected, right? To have a lot more cross-border interactions. And then speaking the same language would provide you the kind of ease and convenience, right? If you're keen on creating social or economic conditions that are conducive for us to interact with each other, right? So, yeah, so in a world defined by interconnectedness and an increasing need for cross-border interactions, speaking the same language would offer ease and convenience between people keen on forging social and economic ties. So this one is, yeah, so I think the if you want to talk about social relationship diplomacy between countries, you can talk about how diplomatic organizations like the UN, they all have like an official language. I think there are 6: English, Chinese, French, Arabic, yeah, and Spanish, and I suspect it's Russian. Yeah, but so you have official languages. So there is kind of a common understanding that in order for different countries to sit together and talk about things in a way that avoids misunderstanding, a common language is crucial, right? So that's an example of how there is indeed uh, this this prevalent view, right? That if you want to ease interaction, if you want to iron out differences, speaking the same language is a way forward. Okay. You can also talk if you want to talk about economics. Maybe an example is how you can increase employment opportunities. How do I mean that? So now we've made like a remote working thing, right? Your work from home. It is possible for me to apply for a job in the UK or the US, right? And all I need to do is as long as the job is a remote work, I can apply for it. I can work in a company that's miles away, and the only thing I need to care about is I just need to adjust to their work hours, right? So imagine now we take away the language barriers, so I can apply for a job in UK, right, a remote work. I probably can't do that for a place like Germany because I don't speak German, or uh, South America because I don't speak Spanish, I don't speak Portuguese. So, but if all of us have this common language, say English, or any other language, then then you have one less barrier, right? We have one less barrier to overcome, and then your people can just do remote work with any countries in the world, because at the end of the day, the it doesn't impede interaction, right? We have removed one impediment in our way, right? So that is, I think, a way in which the world would be a better place. Increased interconnectedness. Uh, you you break down or you make the geographical divide, the cultural divide, less of an obstruction to uh, social interaction. Okay. Um, yeah. Okay. So let's see what are some of the opposing arguments. So okay. So in the first point, we talk about how language is a subset of culture, right? So that point in itself can be an opposing argument if we are looking at cultural diversity. So if language is a part of culture, and then we establish like a dominant language, so the there is a likelihood that we are going to erode some uh, culture, that either uh, they're not as relevant, or they're not as uh, strong, not as significant, but then it is still good to have them around, right? So I'm thinking of some dead languages like Latin and Sanskrit. They are dead for a reason, right? Because people don't use them. Uh, and part of the reason, of course, is that there are some more valuable uh, languages that they use. Therefore, these languages come into disuse. But then the fact that we still everywhere, most everywhere, if you go to any uh, university of significance in the Anglo-European world, you'll find classes that offer Latin, right? Because learning Latin is important if you want to be able to access like some great works from the past, works of academic significance. So the fact that we are still, in fact, there are many efforts, I think, in India to revive Sanskrit. Not very successful because it's not a language that once the number of speakers go to zero, it's actually very difficult to revive it, right? Because you have other more prominent languages surrounding it, right? So I guess the point is that establishing a common language between people can erode cultural diversity, which is characteristic of us as a species, right? And the outcome of an ambition to create a common language would be a culturally impoverished world and people, right, by extension. Okay, so my examples, I think just now I mentioned Latin and Sanskrit, right? I think Sanskrit has virtually zero speakers who speak it as a first language, right? There are people who can speak it because they learned it, but then people who speak it as a first language, I think it's zero. Likewise for Latin, but then you go to, I think, Europe, a lot of people learn Latin because because it helps them appreciate certain works of literature. So there is a value in this, even in these dead languages, there are certain values to them, and the fact that we are relearning it perhaps suggests some kind of regret. Yeah, I think so. Having a common language that is so powerful, you can erode diversity among people. If you want something more like a manifestation of cultural erosion, maybe you can look at Iran and their emphasis on Persian or Persianness, because what they have is like they have a culturally diverse group of people, different languages, different practices, but then they try to homogenize them and make them more Persian by the way they speak, by the way they dress, and you get deprived of certain things because if you do not embody some of the Persian culture, right? If you don't speak the language, I think you you lose access to, you find yourself unable to obtain some kind of aid if you need them, some kind of government services if you need them. Okay, so and then they are also becoming less and less diverse as a result, because everyone is trying to adopt all these languages, practices out of necessity, out of practical need, right? Yeah, okay, and then since we are on the point of erosion of diversity, I think you can also make a point about how minority cultures are at risk more, right? And then you can think of yeah, a global lingua franca poses significant threat to preservation of cultural heritage, as these communities tend to be most at risk of being subverted by a dominant culture. So I'm thinking of like your Native Americans, right? Your Indians, Native Americans losing relevance and declining in status, right? Because of that, because everyone just like if you want to work like in more urban areas, you need English in the US, right? And I think if you want somewhere in Asia, there is the Taiwanese Aborigines, uh, Aborigines, right? The Taiwanese Aborigines. I think there are like a documented 26 languages from the different tribes in the Taiwanese Aborigine community. I think 10 of them are extinct now, the language. A few more are endangered, so I think very soon you'll have fewer than half of the original number. And it's also because it's hard to live a full rural tribal life now, especially in like a metropolis like Taiwan. So eventually they will be absorbed by the dominant culture. They will speak uh, Taiwan, the Taiwanese tongue. They will speak Mandarin, and sooner or later they will all forget all this. So once you start with the language, it slowly encroaches into other aspects of the culture, and eventually the culture disappears. Okay, so those are possible examples that you can use. And then last point probably I would say the most powerful one would be something about how, because the assumption is that we would understand each other better if we speak the same language. So think of how many issues of significance that uh, we contest each other on. How many of them are actually essentially about language? Very few. It's always, if language is involved, it's usually always a symptom of a larger cause, like a race, for example, class, for example, right? So very seldom it's essentially about language. Like language is the only thing that is preventing us from seeing eye to eye, right? I think, in fact, I would say almost never, right? So there are usually a variety of things that we like to fight each other on, and speaking the same language is not going to prevent us from continuing to fight each other on things. Okay, so the point I think essentially is, oh, yeah, there's little indication that language is the essential feature that creates division between people. Prejudice and discrimination do not become resolved simply due to people having a common tongue. And you would just be chasing a phantom if you think that common language is the silver bullet that will allow us to solve all our problems. Okay. Yeah. So I think you can look at racial. Yeah, you can look at racism in most parts of the world. Probably the US, they have quite a great narrative on systemic racism and how, I mean, of course, the African Americans, they have their own slang, they have their own linguistic uh, idiosyncrasies, but then they speak English. At the end of the day, they speak English, mutually intelligible between the blacks and the whites, but doesn't stop them from hating each other, right? Doesn't stop white people from discriminating the black people. And then you can look at uh, separatist movements around the world. So basically, communities that wish to become independent. So I think you have it in Scotland, every time and again there will be issues on Scottish independence, right? I mean, Scottish people, they have their own language, but they speak English. It doesn't make them feel English, right? Taiwan, they speak Mandarin, doesn't make them feel Chinese. Catalonia has quite a rich independence movement that no one actually cares about because it's not China. Yeah, so I mean, Catalonians, they speak Catalan and they speak Spanish, but it doesn't make them feel Spanish, right? In fact, they feel like they have their own distinct culture. So it's not the language that is, having them speak the same language will not magically make them agree with each other, right? Okay, so these are the points roughly that you can have. For your thesis, I would say disagreeing with the proposition would be an easier position to take. So your thesis would be something about how you acknowledge that a common language can allow you to interact with each other better, maybe solve some differences in ideas. But then, like what our last point says, right? Very few conflicts, very few differences in the world are precisely because of language, right? It's usually something else, something I think more deeply related to our identity. And for that reason, there's no reason for me to think that we would be in a better place just because we speak the same language. Yeah, so in fact, quite the opposite, right? If everyone has the same language, we have certain risks, right? As points 3 and 4 would suggest. So we become more bland, I think, as a people. We have less things distinctive to share about as a people. Okay, so your thesis, I suppose, would be, just write it down here. So your thesis, let's see if I can copy it. Okay, so your thesis would be something like that, right? While a common language may allow us to iron out differences in ideas, very few concerns of significance in the world are caused solely by differences in language. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all there is to the question. The arguments here, I think, would be quite sufficient. Okay, yeah, that's all I have. Thank you. Bye bye.